Officer Bradley didn't expect much from his late-night patrol. It was a quiet night, like most others in the small town of Crestwood. The air was still, the streets empty except for the occasional passing car or distant sound of a barking dog. Nights like these usually meant routine traffic stops, maybe a noise complaint from an overly zealous house party, or the odd call about a cat stuck in a tree. After nearly 2 decades on the force, Bradley had grown used to the rhythm of nights like these. They passed slowly but uneventfully. But something about this night felt different, though he couldn't quite place why. It was nearing midnight, and Bradley was driving his usual route down Oakwood Avenue when he saw the lone figure of a teenager walking along the sidewalk. At first, it didn't seem out of place. Kids wandered around at night all the time, especially in Crestwood. It was the kind of town where trouble didn't stretch far beyond the occasional joyride or sneaking into the local diner after curfew. But as Bradley slowed his cruiser to get a better look, something about this particular kid grabbed his attention. The boy's hood was pulled up, obscuring his face, but his posture was what struck Bradley first. The way he walked, head slightly down, shoulders slumped, steps heavy, made him look like he was carrying the weight of the world on his back. It wasn't the stride of someone out for a late-night walk to clear their head or the aimless meander of a teenager trying to kill time. This boy looked like he had nowhere to go, no destination in mind, yet was in no hurry to get there. Bradley felt a strange pull in his chest, a tug of something he couldn't quite name. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he slowed the cruiser to a crawl. Kids probably just out past curfew, Bradley muttered to himself, but even as the words left his mouth, he didn't believe them. There was something else. He watched the boy for a moment longer. The glow of the streetlights flickered across the sidewalk, casting long, shifting shadows. The boy's hood cast his face in darkness, but every so often, the light would catch a glimpse of his profile, a sharp jawline, a slightly upturned nose, high cheekbones. Bradley's heart skipped a beat. There was something disturbingly familiar about him, though Bradley couldn't figure out why. His pulse quickened as his mind raced through the possibilities. Could it be someone he'd arrested before? No, that didn't seem right. This boy didn't carry himself with the cocky defiance of a troublemaker. He looked lost. Bradley shook his head, trying to clear the strange thoughts creeping into his mind. "Focus, Brad," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. He pulled the cruiser over to the side of the road and turned on his lights, not the flashing reds and blues that screamed emergency, just the softer white beam of the spotlight mounted on the side. The boy froze mid-step, his back straightening as the light illuminated him. Slowly, he turned his head toward the car, and for the first time, Bradley caught a clear view of his face. His breath hitched. The boy couldn't have been older than 17 or 18, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to glow in the artificial light. His skin was pale, almost ghostly, and his expression was a mixture of defiance and fear. But it wasn't just the boy's appearance that caught Bradley off guard, it was the way his features seemed to mirror someone Bradley had thought about every single day for the past 5 years. Someone he'd lost. Bradley's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. His mind raced, memories flashing like lightning in a storm. The boy didn't just resemble someone, he resembled his son. "Impossible," Bradley muttered, his voice hoarse. His son, Ethan, had died in a car accident 5 years ago. The grief of that loss had been suffocating, nearly consuming Bradley whole. Even now, after all this time, the ache in his chest hadn't dulled. There were days when he thought he saw Ethan's face in a crowd, heard his voice in the laughter of a passerby, or felt his presence in the quiet moments of solitude. But it was always just a trick of the mind, a cruel joke played by his grieving heart. This was different. The boy standing in the spotlight wasn't Ethan. Bradley knew that much. But the resemblance was uncanny. It was in the shape of his face, the way his jaw tightened as if bracing for a fight, the piercing gaze that seemed to look straight through Bradley and into his soul. Taking a deep breath, Bradley reached for the door handle and stepped out of the car. The cool night air hit him like a slap, snapping him back to reality. He adjusted his belt and approached the boy cautiously, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder of the road. "Hey, kid," Bradley called, keeping his voice steady but firm. "You okay?" The boy didn't answer right away. Instead, he shoved his hands into the pockets of his hoodie and glanced away, his jaw tightening. Bradley noticed the faint tremor in his shoulders, the subtle way his body seemed to stiffen with every step Bradley took closer. "I said, are you okay?" Bradley repeated, stopping a few feet away. The boy finally spoke, his voice low and defensive. "Yeah. I'm fine." Bradley studied him closely, his sharp gaze catching the way the boy's eyes flickered with unease. He wasn't fine, far from it. But Bradley wasn't here to push, at least not yet. "What are you doing out here this late?" he asked, his tone softening slightly. "Just walking," the boy replied curtly. "Walking where?" "Nowhere." The answer struck Bradley as odd, but he didn't press the issue. He glanced down and noticed something glinting around the boy's neck, a small, silver pendant hanging from a thin chain. The light from the cruiser's spotlight caught it perfectly, and Bradley felt his chest tighten again. It was the same necklace he had given Ethan on his 15th birthday. His knees nearly buckled under the weight of the realization, but he forced himself to stand tall. His mind screamed at him to make sense of what he was seeing, but the answers wouldn't come. "What's that you've got there?" Bradley asked, nodding toward the necklace. The boy's hand instinctively flew to the pendant, clutching it protectively. "It's nothing," he said quickly. "Doesn't look like nothing to me," Bradley replied, his voice careful. The boy's eyes narrowed. "Why do you care?" Bradley opened his mouth to respond but hesitated. What could he say? That the necklace looked exactly like the one he'd given his son? That this whole encounter was dredging up emotions he wasn't ready to face? That the resemblance between this boy and Ethan was enough to make his heart feel like it was being ripped in two? Instead, he took a step back and sighed. "Look, kid, I'm not here to give you a hard time. But it's late, and you're out here all alone. Let me give you a ride somewhere. Home, maybe." The boy's expression softened for just a moment, but then the walls went back up. "I don't need a ride," he said firmly. "I can take care of myself." Bradley studied him for a long moment, the silence between them heavy and charged. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said, stepping back toward his cruiser. "But be careful out here. It's not safe to be wandering around alone." The boy didn't respond. He simply turned and started walking again, his figure disappearing into the shadows. But as Bradley watched him go, the strange, unshakable feeling lingered, the feeling that this boy, whoever he was, wasn't just some random kid on the street. He was connected to Bradley in a way he couldn't yet understand. And he wasn't about to let it go. Bradley stood frozen for a moment, his hands resting on his hips as he watched the boy fade into the shadows. His mind buzzed with questions, but none of them had answers, not yet. He wasn't sure what had compelled him to stop in the first place, and now, he wasn't sure what to do next. The necklace. That silver pendant, gleaming under the spotlight, wouldn't leave his thoughts. It was unique, with a small engraving of an oak tree on its surface. He'd had it custom made for Ethan years ago, a symbol of strength, resilience, and their shared love for the massive oak tree that grew in their backyard. Ethan had worn it every day until the accident. After Ethan's death, Bradley had searched through his belongings, hoping to find it, but the necklace had been gone. His wife, Claire, had speculated that Ethan might have taken it off somewhere and forgotten to put it back on. Bradley had always held on to the faint hope that it would turn up someday, tucked away in a drawer or hidden under a couch cushion. But it never did. And now, here it was. Or was it? Bradley shook his head, trying to dispel the irrational thought. The necklace couldn't possibly be the same one. There were thousands of pendants in the world with similar designs. It was just a coincidence, an eerie, unsettling coincidence. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling. Bradley climbed back into his cruiser, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. He stared down the street where the boy had disappeared, debating with himself. Part of him wanted to follow, to demand answers, to find out who this kid was and why he had a necklace so similar to Ethan's. The other part of him warned against it. He was a cop, not a private investigator. The kid hadn't done anything illegal. He couldn't just follow him around because of a gut feeling. But the resemblance. That was harder to dismiss. The boy's face, his eyes, the sharp angles of his jaw, it was like looking at a younger version of Ethan. Get a grip, Bradley, he muttered to himself. You're seeing what you want to see. But as much as he tried to convince himself, the pull in his chest wouldn't go away. He started the engine and rolled forward, keeping his lights off this time. He wasn't following the boy, not really, just making sure he was safe. That's what he told himself. The quiet hum of the cruiser's engine filled the silence as Bradley drove slowly down the street, scanning the sidewalk. The boy had turned a corner a few minutes earlier, disappearing into the maze of side streets and alleys that made up Crestwood's older neighborhoods. Bradley frowned. It was a strange route to take if the boy was heading home. Most kids stuck to the main roads, where the street lights offered some sense of security. The side streets were dark and narrow, lined with crumbling fences and overgrown hedges. They weren't exactly dangerous, but they weren't inviting, either. Why would the kid go this way? Bradley's stomach churned with unease as he turned the corner and continued down the street. He slowed to a crawl, scanning the dimly lit sidewalks for any sign of movement. There. The boy was up ahead, about half a block away. He was moving quickly now, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets and his head down. Bradley could see the tension in his posture, the way his shoulders were hunched as if he was trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable. Something was wrong. Bradley turned off the engine and coasted to a stop, watching from a distance. The boy glanced over his shoulder, his movements sharp and anxious. He didn't spot the cruiser in the shadows, but his behavior only confirmed Bradley's suspicions. This wasn't just a kid out for a late-night walk. He was running from something or someone. The boy darted into an alley, disappearing from view. Bradley cursed under his breath and opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. He hesitated for a moment, then reached for his flashlight. He wasn't sure what he was getting himself into, but his instincts told him he couldn't just let this go. The alley was narrow and lined with tall brick walls, their surfaces slick with years of grime. The dim light from a single flickering bulb barely illuminated the path ahead. Bradley moved cautiously, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. "Kid," he called, keeping his voice low but firm. No answer. The alley stretched on for what felt like forever, twisting and turning in unexpected directions. Bradley's flashlight cut through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. He scanned every corner, every nook and cranny, but there was no sign of the boy. Then he heard a faint rustling sound, like someone shifting their weight on loose gravel. It came from just around the next corner. Bradley tightened his grip on the flashlight and approached slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He rounded the corner, his beam of light sweeping across the ground, and froze. The boy was there, crouched against the wall, his back pressed tightly to the bricks. His hood was pulled down lower now, obscuring most of his face, but Bradley could see the faint glint of the necklace around his neck. "Hey," Bradley said, keeping his tone calm. "It's just me. I'm not here to hurt you." The boy didn't respond. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his breathing shallow and uneven. Bradley could see the fear in his body language, the way his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of his hoodie. "Are you in trouble?" Bradley asked, taking a cautious step closer. The boy finally looked up, his blue eyes locking onto Bradley's. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged, until the boy finally muttered, "Why are you following me?" Bradley hesitated, unsure of how to answer. He couldn't exactly explain the strange pull he felt or the way the boy reminded him so painfully of his son. Instead, he said, "I just want to make sure you're okay." The boy scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yeah, sure. That's all." Bradley sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, kid, I know you don't trust me. But you're out here all alone in the middle of the night, and you seem, I don't know, lost. Scared, maybe. I just want to help." The boy's expression hardened. "I don't need help." "Then what do you need?" Bradley pressed. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he stood abruptly and started to walk away, his steps hurried and uneven. Bradley reached out instinctively, his hand brushing against the boy's arm. "Wait," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. The boy stopped but didn't turn around. For a moment, they stood in silence, the tension thick in the air. Finally, the boy said, "Just leave me alone." And then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness before Bradley could say another word. Bradley's fingers instinctively tensed, brushing the smooth leather of his belt as he watched the boy's silhouette under the weak glow of the street lamp. His heartbeat quickened, though he couldn't explain why. There was something off about this encounter, something he couldn't shake. "Where are you heading this late, kid?" Bradley's voice carried an edge of authority, but he softened it just enough to avoid scaring the boy. The kid paused, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, but didn't look up. His hood obscured most of his face, but Bradley could see the way his hands trembled, fingers twitching near his sides like he was ready to bolt. "Nowhere," the boy mumbled, barely audible. Bradley took a step closer, careful to move slowly. "Nowhere's an odd place to be heading at this hour." The boy's head lifted slightly, and for the first time, his face was partially visible. The dim light caught his features, a sharp jawline, a stubborn set to his lips, and those eyes. Piercing. Familiar. Bradley's breath hitched. For a split second, it was as if time rewound. He was back in his kitchen, Ethan sitting at the table, his head tilted in that same way as he argued about curfews. The flash of recognition was so strong that Bradley had to blink, grounding himself in the present. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, the resemblance was undeniable. "Kid, do I know you?" The words slipped out before he could stop them. The boy stiffened, and his head dipped again, the hood swallowing his face in shadow. "No," he muttered. "Are you sure?" Bradley pressed, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. The boy's shoulders tightened as if he were bracing himself. "It's none of your business," he snapped, his tone sharper this time. He turned on his heel, walking briskly toward the end of the street. That's when Bradley saw it. A faint glint at the boy's neck, catching the dim street light just right. It was the necklace. Bradley's heart sank, a cold weight settling in his chest. The silver pendant with the oak tree engraving, it wasn't just similar. It was identical. "Wait," he called, his voice louder now. The boy didn't stop. "Kid." Bradley jogged after him, his boots echoing against the pavement. He wasn't trying to scare him, but he couldn't let him go. Not without answers. The boy broke into a run. Bradley cursed under his breath, chasing after him. The kid was fast, weaving through the dark streets like he knew them by heart. Bradley was losing ground, his lungs burning as he pushed himself harder. "Stop!" Bradley shouted. "I just want to talk." The boy disappeared around a corner, and for a moment, Bradley thought he'd lost him. But then he spotted the edge of the hood peeking out from behind a dumpster. "Gotcha, he muttered, approaching carefully. He rounded the corner, shining his flashlight into the alley. The boy flinched, throwing up a hand to shield his face. "Relax," Bradley said, panting as he caught his breath. He lowered the flashlight, angling it toward the ground. "I'm not going to hurt you." The boy stayed pressed against the wall, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "Why'd you run?" Bradley asked, his voice gentler now. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he tugged the hood lower, as if trying to disappear beneath it. "Look," Bradley said, kneeling slightly to meet his eye level. "I just want to talk. That's all. Can you at least tell me your name?" The boy hesitated, then muttered, "Jake." "Okay, Jake." Bradley nodded, his tone steady. "Why don't you tell me what you're doing out here? It's late, and it's not exactly safe to be wandering around alone." Jake shrugged, his movements defensive. "I'm fine. I don't need help." Bradley studied him, taking in the dirt smudges on his face, the way his clothes hung loose on his thin frame. This wasn't just a rebellious kid sneaking out for a joyride. Jake looked like he hadn't had a proper meal or a warm place to stay in days. "You look like you've been through a lot," Bradley said carefully. "If something's going on, I can help. You don't have to do this alone." Jake's jaw tightened. "I don't need help," he repeated, his voice firmer this time. Bradley sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Then explain something to me." He pointed toward Jake's neck. "That necklace. Where'd you get it?" Jake's hand flew to the pendant instinctively, clutching it like it was a lifeline. His eyes darted up, meeting Bradley's gaze for the first time, and there it was again, that haunting familiarity. "It's mine," Jake said defensively. "Did someone give it to you?" Bradley pressed, his voice soft but insistent. Jake's lips pressed into a thin line, and he looked away. Bradley's chest tightened. "Jake," he said, choosing his words carefully, "that necklace, it looks exactly like one I gave to someone very important to me. Someone I lost. Can you tell me where you got it?" Jake didn't answer. His hand stayed wrapped around the pendant, his knuckles white. Bradley took a deep breath, trying to steady the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "Listen," he said, "I'm not accusing you of anything. I just need to know the truth. Please." For a moment, Jake seemed to consider it. His shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining out of him. But then his expression hardened again, and he shook his head. "I don't owe you anything," he said, his voice cold. Bradley felt a pang of frustration, but he held it back. "You're right," he said. "You don't. But if you're in trouble—" "I'm not in trouble." Jake snapped, his voice rising. "Why can't you just leave me alone?" Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but Jake didn't give him a chance. He shoved past him, sprinting down the alley before Bradley could stop him. "Jake, wait!" Bradley called, his voice echoing against the brick walls. But Jake was gone, swallowed by the darkness once again. Bradley stood frozen in the alleyway, his breathing heavy and his pulse racing. The boy's reaction only deepened the gnawing feeling in his gut. The resemblance, the necklace, it was too much to ignore. But Jake's defiance left him with more questions than answers. Bradley turned back toward his patrol car, his step slow and heavy. As he slid into the driver's seat, he rested his hands on the steering wheel, staring into the dark horizon. That necklace wasn't just a random trinket, it was unique, handcrafted. He had commissioned it years ago for Ethan, his son, after a long hike they'd taken together in the woods. Ethan had loved oak trees, their strength, their resilience. "Breathe, Brad," he muttered to himself. "It's just a coincidence." But coincidences didn't explain the weight in his chest or the eerie familiarity in Jake's piercing eyes. Bradley pulled out his notepad, jotting down the details of the encounter. He wrote quickly, recording Jake's description, the route he'd taken, and the necklace. As he wrote, flashes of his last moments with Ethan surfaced: his son's laughter, the way his eyes sparkled when he talked about his future. And then, the crash. The screech of tires, the shattered glass, the deafening silence. Bradley shook his head, trying to push the memory back into the recesses of his mind. This isn't him, he told himself. It can't be. Yet, deep down, a small voice whispered, "What if it is?" The next night, Bradley found himself driving the same route. The street lights flickered faintly, casting long shadows over the quiet roads. It was late past midnight and the city felt eerily still. His eyes scanned the sidewalks, searching for any sign of Jake. He told himself he wasn't obsessing, that it was just part of his job to follow up. But he couldn't deny the pull, the nagging feeling that he'd missed something important the night before. Halfway down the block, he spotted a figure. The hood, the hunched shoulders, it was Jake. Bradley's heart quickened. He slowed the car, parking at the curb a short distance away. This time, he decided to take a different approach. No flashlight, no commands, just a conversation. "Jake," he called softly as he approached. The boy stiffened but didn't run. He turned slightly, his face shadowed by the hood. "What do you want now?" Jake asked, his tone guarded. "I just want to talk," Bradley said, keeping his hands visible. "No pressure, no trouble. I promise." Jake hesitated, his eyes flicking to the patrol car behind Bradley. He crossed his arms, his body language defensive but not entirely closed off. "Why do you care?" Jake asked finally. Bradley took a deep breath, deciding to be honest. "Because there's something about you that I can't ignore. The necklace, the way you look. It reminds me of someone I lost. Someone who meant everything to me." Jake shifted uncomfortably, his fingers brushing the pendant around his neck. "I'm not that person," he said, his voice quieter now. "I know," Bradley replied gently. "I'm not saying you are. But that necklace, where did you get it? Did someone give it to you?" Jake looked away, his jaw tightening. "Jake," Bradley said softly, "I'm not here to accuse you of anything. If it's yours, that's fine. I need to understand." Jake's shoulders slumped slightly, the tension easing just a bit. He fiddled with the chain, rolling the pendant between his fingers. "It was my mom's," he said finally. Bradley's eyebrows furrowed. "Your mom's?" Jake nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. "She gave it to me before she died." The words hit Bradley like a punch to the gut. He hadn't expected that. "I'm sorry to hear that," Bradley said sincerely. Jake shrugged, his voice flat. "It doesn't matter. She's gone." "It does matter," Bradley said, stepping closer. "Losing someone you love. It changes you." Jake didn't respond, but the way his hand gripped the pendant told Bradley he was listening. "Can I ask you something?" Bradley continued. Jake glanced up briefly, then nodded. "Do you know where your mom got that necklace?" Jake hesitated, his fingers stilling. "She said it was from someone important. She didn't talk about it much. Just said it was special." Bradley's chest tightened. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more implausible than the last. Could it really be the same necklace? "What about your dad?" Bradley asked gently. "Did he give it to her?" Jake's expression hardened. "I don't have a dad," he said bitterly. The words stung more than they should have. Bradley's instincts told him there was more to Jake's story than he was letting on. "Jake," Bradley said, his tone firm but kind, "I'm not trying to pry. But if there's something you're not telling me, something I can help with, you've got to let me in." Jake looked at him for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mix of distrust and vulnerability. Then he shook his head and turned away. "You can't help," he said over his shoulder as he walked off. Bradley watched him go, his heart sinking. He felt like he was on the edge of something important, but Jake's walls were impenetrable. Back at the station, Bradley couldn't shake the encounter. He dug through old case files, searching for any clue that might connect Jake to his past. Hours turned into dawn, and just as he was about to give up, he found something. A missing persons report. It was from years ago, filed by a woman named Clara Bennett. The description of the boy 5 years old at the time matched Jake. And then there was the photo. Bradley's breath caught. The boy in the picture had the same piercing eyes, the same sharp features. And around his neck was the necklace. It was Ethan's necklace. Bradley leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The implications were staggering. Could Jake really be connected to Ethan? If so, how? And why had Clara never mentioned a father in the report? His hands trembled as he picked up the phone. It was time to find out the truth. Bradley watched as the boy froze for a moment, his fists tightening by his sides. The street lights cast long shadows around them, the air thick with unspoken tension. For a second, it seemed like Jake might bolt, but instead, he slowly turned, his hood still shadowing most of his face. "What's your name?" Bradley repeated, his tone soft but firm. The boy hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Jake," he muttered, barely loud enough for Bradley to hear. "Jake," Bradley repeated, as if testing how it felt to say the name. It didn't match the face staring back at him. This boy, he had a presence, a familiarity that clawed at Bradley's memories. "And your last name?" Bradley pressed gently, stepping closer. Jake's jaw tightened. "Why do you care? I don't need your help." Bradley stopped in his tracks, sensing the boy's rising defensiveness. "I'm not trying to get in your business," he said carefully. "But that necklace," he pointed toward the pendant resting against Jake's chest. "It's not just any necklace. I know where it came from." Jake's hand instinctively went to the pendant, his fingers curling around it protectively. "It was my mom's," he said quickly, as if that was the end of the conversation. "Your mom," Bradley echoed. His mind raced. The missing persons report, the familiar features, the timeline, it was all swirling into a picture he couldn't quite complete. "Jake, listen," he began, his voice steady. "This necklace, it looks exactly like one I gave to someone I loved. Someone I lost." Jake's eyes flickered with something: hesitation, confusion, fear, before he looked away. "It's just a necklace," he said, his voice hollow. "It doesn't mean anything." But Bradley could see it in his face, the way he gripped the chain like a lifeline. It did mean something. Bradley's patrol car crawled slowly behind Jake as the boy continued walking. He stayed a careful distance away, not wanting to spook him, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. He felt like a thread had been tugged loose, and if he let go now, the truth would unravel completely out of reach. Jake eventually turned down a narrow alleyway, disappearing into the shadows. Bradley parked and got out, his hand instinctively brushing the radio at his belt. He didn't call for backup. This wasn't about police work anymore. The alley was dark, the only light spilling in from a flickering bulb above a rusted metal door. Bradley heard the faint scuff of footsteps and followed them, his own boots crunching softly against the gravel. "Jake," he called out, his voice low but steady. No response. Bradley turned a corner and stopped. Ahead, Jake was sitting on an overturned crate, his head down and his hands fidgeting with the necklace. He looked smaller now, less defiant and more vulnerable, like a kid carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Why are you following me?" Jake asked without looking up. "Because I think you're hiding something," Bradley said honestly, stepping closer. "And I think you're scared." Jake's head shot up, his eyes blazing. "I'm not scared," he snapped. "I don't need anyone, okay? Not you, not anyone else." The outburst echoed down the alley, but Bradley didn't flinch. He could see the cracks beneath Jake's anger, the pain trying to claw its way out. "Everyone needs someone, Jake," Bradley said gently. "Even if it's just someone to listen." Jake's hands trembled slightly as he let the necklace dangle from his fingers. The pendant swung back and forth, catching the dim light. "My mom gave me this," Jake said suddenly, his voice quieter now. "She said it would protect me. That it was from someone who cared about her a long time ago." Bradley's breath caught. "Did she ever tell you who?" Jake shook his head. "She didn't like talking about the past. Said it was better to forget." "But you didn't forget," Bradley said, taking another step closer. "You've held onto that necklace because it means something to you." "To her?" Jake looked up at him, his eyes glistening. "Why do you care so much about a stupid necklace?" "Because it's not stupid," Bradley said, his voice breaking slightly. "It's the same necklace I gave my son years ago. Before he died." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake stared at him, his expression unreadable, as if he was trying to process the weight of Bradley's words. The next day, Bradley sat at his desk, poring over files he hadn't touched in years. Old police reports, case notes, photographs, they were scattered across the table in a chaotic attempt to piece together the past. He found the photo he'd been looking for. It was slightly faded, but the image was clear: Ethan, his son, smiling brightly with the silver pendant around his neck. Bradley traced a finger over the photo, his heart aching. He thought about Jake's face, the way it had softened for just a moment when he'd mentioned Ethan. There was something there, a connection, a thread that Bradley couldn't let go of. He picked up his phone and made a call. "Clara Bennett," he said to the officer on the other end. "I need everything we have on her missing persons report from 8 years ago. And see if you can track down any relatives or known associates. It's urgent." That evening, Bradley found himself back on the same stretch of road, waiting. He wasn't sure if Jake would show up again, but he had to try. The city around him felt quieter than usual, as if it, too, was holding its breath. And then, in the distance, he saw him. Jake walked with the same wary stride, his hands stuffed into his pockets and his hood pulled low. Bradley stepped out of the car and waited, letting Jake come to him. "Hey," Bradley said as Jake approached. Jake stopped, eyeing him suspiciously. "You again?" Bradley nodded. "Yeah, me again." Jake sighed, clearly annoyed. "What do you want now?" "To talk," Bradley said simply. Jake groaned. "You keep saying that, but you never say why." Bradley took a deep breath, deciding it was time to lay his cards on the table. "Because I think you're connected to someone I lost. And I think your mom might have known him, too." Jake frowned, his posture stiffening. "What are you talking about?" "Your necklace," Bradley said, pointing to it again. "It's not just similar to the one I gave my son, it's the same one. I don't know how, or why, but I need to figure it out. And I think you do, too." Jake stared at him, his expression a mix of confusion and frustration. "You're crazy," he said, shaking his head. "Maybe," Bradley admitted. "But don't you want to know the truth?" Jake turned away, his shoulders tense. The pendant swayed against his chest as if mocking the silence that had settled between them. Bradley could feel the frustration radiating off the boy, but he stood firm. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore, it was about finding the missing pieces to a puzzle that had haunted him for years. "You think I haven't asked myself those questions?" Jake finally said, his voice low and bitter. "Where I came from, why my mom always looked over her shoulder like someone was chasing us. But every time I asked, she shut me down. Said it wasn't safe to know. Bradley's chest tightened. There was more to this than he'd initially thought, and every word Jake said felt like another thread tying their lives together. What happened to her? Bradley asked gently. Jake tensed again, his hand tightening around the pendant. She disappeared, he muttered. About a year ago. One day she went to work and never came home. The cops said she probably ran off, but I know that's not true. She wouldn't just leave me like that. Bradley's mind raced. Clara Bennett's missing persons report came back to him, a woman who vanished without a trace, leaving behind a teenage son. He had read the file once, but back then, it was just another unsolved case in a stack of many. Now it was different. Now it was personal. Jake, Bradley said, his tone steady, I think your mom's disappearance is connected to something bigger. And I think it's tied to that necklace you're wearing. Jake turned back to him, his eyes narrowing. You keep talking about this necklace like it's magic or something. What does it even mean to you? Bradley reached into his pocket and pulled out the old photograph of Ethan, his son. He handed it to Jake, who stared at it with a mix of confusion and disbelief. That's my son, Bradley said, his voice breaking slightly. His name was Ethan. He died 8 years ago in a car accident. But before that, I gave him that necklace. It was supposed to be a symbol of strength, something to remind him that no matter what, I'd always be there for him. Jake's gaze shifted from the photo to the necklace in his hand. But, how did it end up with me? I don't know, Bradley admitted. But I think your mom might have the answers. The two of them walked side by side now, the tension between them easing slightly. Jake's guard was still up, but Bradley could see cracks forming in the walls he'd built around himself. As they walked, Bradley couldn't help but notice the small details about Jake, the way he rubbed his thumb against the pendant when he was lost in thought, the slight tremble in his hands when he talked about his mom. This wasn't just a boy on the streets, this was someone carrying a burden far too heavy for his age. Do you remember anything strange about the day your mom disappeared? Bradley asked. Jake nodded slowly. Yeah. She was acting weird the whole week before. Jumpy, like she was scared of something. She kept checking the windows, locking the doors twice, stuff like that. And then, the day she vanished, she gave me this. He held up the necklace. She said it would keep me safe, no matter what. Bradley frowned. Did she say who she thought was after her? Jake shook his head. No. She just said that if anything happened to her, I should keep this close and trust no one. Except me, Bradley said, almost as a challenge. Jake hesitated, then shrugged. Maybe. Later that evening, they found themselves sitting on the steps of an old community center. The building was abandoned, its paint peeling and windows boarded up, but it offered a quiet place to talk. You think she's still alive? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Bradley didn't answer right away. He had seen enough cases to know how these stories usually ended. But this one felt different. Clara Bennett's disappearance wasn't random, it was deliberate. Someone had wanted her gone, and the necklace was at the center of it all. I don't know, Bradley said honestly. But I do know this, if she trusted you enough to give you that necklace, she believed you'd find a way to uncover the truth. Jake stared at the pendant, his expression unreadable. I don't even know where to start. We start with what we know, Bradley said. Your mom worked as a nurse, right? Jake nodded. Then we'll go to her workplace, talk to the people who knew her. Someone must have seen or heard something. Jake looked at him, a flicker of hope in his eyes. You'd do that? Help me find her. Bradley met his gaze, his voice firm. I'm not giving up on you, Jake. Or your mom. The next morning, they drove to the hospital where Clara Bennett had worked. The building loomed large and impersonal, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly in the lobby. Bradley flashed his badge at the receptionist, who directed them to the HR office. "We're looking for any records or reports related to Clara Bennett," Bradley explained to the woman behind the desk. The woman frowned, flipping through a file cabinet. "Clara Bennett, yes, she worked here, but she left a year ago. No one's heard from her since." Bradley exchanged a glance with Jake. "Did she leave any personal effects behind?" "A locker, maybe." The woman nodded. "We cleared out her locker when she didn't come back. Most of it was sent to her home address, but there's one box in storage that was never claimed." "Can we see it?" Bradley asked. The woman hesitated, then sighed. "I'll need to get clearance, but I can have someone bring it up in about 15 minutes. As they waited, Jake sat quietly, his fingers tapping against his knee. Bradley could see the anxiety building in him and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Whatever's in that box," Bradley said, "we'll figure it out together." When the box arrived, it was smaller than either of them had expected. The contents were sparse: a pair of worn-out sneakers, a few books, and a sealed envelope. Jake reached for the envelope, his hands shaking slightly. Inside was a handwritten letter addressed to him. *Jake. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't keep my promise to stay with you. I'm sorry. There are things about my past I never told you, things I wanted to protect you from. But now it's up to you to find the answers. The necklace I gave you isn't just a piece of jewelry, it's the key to everything. Trust it, and trust yourself. Love. Mom. *. Jake stared at the letter, tears welling in his eyes. Bradley felt a lump form in his throat as he watched the boy struggle to keep his composure. "It's not fair," Jake whispered. "She didn't deserve this." "No, she didn't," Bradley agreed. "But we're going to find out what happened. I promise you that." The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture was still incomplete. The necklace, the letter, Clara's fear, it all pointed to something much bigger than either of them had anticipated. And Bradley knew they were only just beginning to uncover the truth. The world seemed to stand still as Bradley studied the boy's reaction to the photograph. The faint glint of recognition in Jake's eyes was unmistakable. For a long, drawn-out moment, neither of them spoke, the silence brimming with questions neither dared to voice. Jake's fingers tightened around the pendant, his knuckles white. "You knew my mom?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Bradley's throat tightened. He nodded slowly, his heart pounding against his ribs. "I didn't just know her," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. She was family." The boy's face twisted in confusion and disbelief. "What are you talking about? My mom never said anything about you. She never even mentioned a family." Bradley took a deep breath, steadying himself for the truth he'd spent years burying. "Jake, your mom was my son Ethan's wife. That makes you my grandson." Jake's face turned pale, his eyes darting between Bradley and the photograph. "No, that's not possible," he said, shaking his head. "My dad died before I was born. My mom never said anything about him having a dad, let alone you." "I know this is a lot," Bradley said, his voice trembling, "but it's the truth. That necklace, it's proof. I gave one just like it to Ethan, my son, before." He couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. Jake took a step back, his breathing quickening. "Why would she keep this from me? Why wouldn't she tell me?" Bradley could see the walls going up again, the boy retreating into himself. He stepped closer but kept his tone calm and steady. "Maybe she was trying to protect you, Jake. From what, I don't know. But she loved you. That much is clear." Jake looked down at the pendant, his fingers tracing the intricate design. "She said this would keep me safe," he murmured. "But safe from what?" Bradley's mind raced, piecing together fragments of the puzzle. Clara had vanished under suspicious circumstances, leaving behind a cryptic letter and this pendant, a pendant tied to his own son. He thought of all the times he'd tried to forget, to move on from the pain of losing Ethan. And now, here he was, standing in front of Ethan's child, with more questions than answers. "Jake," Bradley said carefully, "did your mom ever tell you anything about your dad? Anything at all?" Jake hesitated, his brow furrowing as he searched his memory. "Not much," he admitted. "She'd get quiet whenever I asked. The only thing she ever told me was that he was brave. And that he loved me." Bradley's chest tightened. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Ethan was brave," he said softly. "He would have loved you more than anything." Jake glanced up, his guarded expression faltering for just a moment. "If you're really my grandfather," he said slowly, "then why didn't you look for me? Why weren't you there for my mom?" Bradley flinched at the question, guilt washing over him like a tidal wave. "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking. "After Ethan died, I lost myself. I didn't even know he had a child. If I had, I swear I would have been there." Jake studied him, the skepticism in his eyes slowly giving way to something softer. "Hope, maybe." As the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, Bradley realized there was one more place they needed to look. "Jake," he said, his voice firm, "we need to find out what happened to your mom. And I think this necklace is the key." Jake frowned, holding up the pendant. "How can a necklace be the key to anything?" Bradley leaned closer, pointing to the small etching on the back of the pendant. "This symbol, it's not just decoration. It's a mark. And I think it's tied to why your mom disappeared." Jake stared at the symbol, his brow furrowing. "You think someone's after me because of this?" "I don't know," Bradley admitted. "But I do know this, whoever wanted to hurt your mom might come after you next. We need to figure this out before it's too late." Their first stop was Clara's old apartment. The building was run down, its once bright paint now faded and peeling. Jake hesitated at the door, his fingers trembling as he reached for the key. "It's been a while since I've been here," he said quietly. "Feels weird coming back." Bradley placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through this together," he said. Inside, the apartment was eerily quiet, the air thick with dust and memories. Jake led Bradley to his mom's bedroom, where they began searching for clues. After nearly an hour of digging through drawers and boxes, Jake pulled out a small journal. "This was hers," he said, handing it to Bradley. Bradley flipped through the pages, his heart sinking as he read Clara's scribbled notes. They were full of cryptic warnings and fragmented thoughts. "They're watching us. The necklace must stay safe. Ethan's father was right, danger follows this family." "What does it mean?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. Bradley shook his head. "I'm not sure. But it sounds like she was trying to protect you from something. Or someone." As they left the apartment, Bradley's phone buzzed. It was a message from a contact in the police department, a lead on Clara's disappearance. "An old friend of mine might have some answers," Bradley told Jake. "Let's go." They arrived at a dimly lit office, where Detective Harris was waiting. Harris had been working on Clara's case when she vanished, and he greeted Bradley with a firm handshake. "I've been looking into this since you called," Harris said. "There's something you need to see." He handed Bradley a file containing surveillance photos. One of the images showed Clara meeting with a man in a dark suit, his face partially obscured. "Who is that?" Jake asked, leaning over the table. "We don't know," Harris admitted. "But Clara seemed afraid of him. She met with him just days before she disappeared." Bradley's gaze shifted to the man's hand, which rested on a briefcase. The same symbol from the pendant was etched onto the leather. This isn't a coincidence, Bradley said. That man, he's connected to everything. The necklace, Clara's disappearance, and Jake. The room fell silent as the weight of the revelation settled over them. Jake looked to Bradley, his expression a mix of fear and determination. What do we do now? Bradley straightened, his jaw set with resolve. We find him. And we get the answers your mom couldn't give us. For the first time, Bradley felt like he wasn't just chasing ghosts. He was chasing the truth, one that might finally bring closure to the pain that had haunted him for years. The storm was far from over, but for the first time, he and Jake weren't facing it alone. Together, they would uncover the secrets buried in the past, no matter how dangerous the journey might be. The weight of their decision hung in the air as they left the detective's office. Jake walked a few steps ahead, his shoulders tense, his hands jammed into his hoodie pockets. Bradley stayed close, his protective instincts on high alert. Jake, Bradley called after a moment, his voice steady. We're in this together. You don't have to carry everything alone. Jake stopped, turning just enough for Bradley to see the uncertainty etched into his expression. I've always been alone, he muttered. I'm not sure I know how to trust anyone anymore. Bradley stepped closer, lowering his voice. You don't have to trust me all at once. Just, take it one step at a time. We'll figure this out. I promise. Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled the pendant from beneath his hoodie and stared at it, his thumb brushing over the engraved symbol. This thing feels like it's cursed, he said bitterly. Every time I think I'm done with it, something worse happens. Bradley reached out, his hand hovering near the pendant before he stopped himself. It's not a curse, Jake. It's a clue. And we're going to use it to make sure no one else gets hurt. They decided to track down the man in the surveillance photo, starting with the last known location Detective Harris had provided. The address led them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place that looked as if it hadn't seen life in decades. Jake hesitated at the entrance, glancing at Bradley. This is crazy. We don't even know if he's still here. Bradley placed a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder. Sometimes, you have to follow the trail, even if it's faint. Stay close and let me handle this. Inside, the warehouse was eerily silent. Dust floated in the beams of moonlight streaming through broken windows. The faint echo of their footsteps filled the space, making every sound seem louder than it was. Bradley's eyes scanned the room, taking in every shadow and corner. He spotted a makeshift desk in the far corner, littered with papers and a laptop. Over there, he whispered, motioning for Jake to follow. As they approached, Jake's sharp intake of breath made Bradley pause. What is it? He asked. Jake pointed to a photograph pinned to the wall above the desk. It was a picture of Clara, her face partially obscured but unmistakable. Beneath it was a note written in bold, block letters, "Protect the boy at all costs." The words sent a chill down Bradley's spine. He turned to Jake, whose expression had shifted from fear to anger. Protect me from what? Jake demanded, his voice rising. Bradley didn't have an answer. He sifted through the papers on the desk, searching for anything that might offer a clue. One document caught his eye, a list of names, each one crossed out except for Clara's and Jake's. This isn't random, Bradley said, his voice grim. Whoever this guy is, he's been keeping track of people connected to the symbol. And you're the last name on the list. Jake clenched his fists, his breathing unsteady. I'm done being someone's target. If this guy wants me, he can come find me. Bradley grabbed Jake's arm, forcing him to meet his gaze. No. We don't play into their hands. We stay smart, and we stay together. Do you understand? Jake hesitated before nodding, the fire in his eyes dimming slightly. Yeah. I get it. As they left the warehouse, the faint sound of an engine starting nearby made them freeze. Bradley's instincts kicked in immediately. "Get down," he ordered, pushing Jake behind a stack of crates. A sleek black SUV rolled into view, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The driver's window rolled down, revealing the man from the surveillance photo. His cold eyes scanned the warehouse before he stepped out, his movements calculated and deliberate. Bradley motioned for Jake to stay quiet as he watched the man approach the desk. The man's gaze fell on the photograph of Clara, and his jaw tightened. He muttered something under his breath, then began rifling through the papers. Jake shifted beside Bradley, his frustration evident. "We should confront him," he whispered. "No," Bradley hissed. "Not yet. We need to know what we're dealing with first." They watched as the man pulled a small device from his pocket and placed it on the desk. A red light blinked, and a faint beeping sound filled the air. "He's setting something up," Bradley realized, his mind racing. "We need to move now." Grabbing Jake's arm, Bradley led him toward the nearest exit, keeping low and quiet. Just as they reached the door, a loud explosion rocked the warehouse, sending them sprawling to the ground outside. Jake coughed, his ears ringing as he struggled to sit up. "What the hell was that?" he shouted. Bradley helped him to his feet, his own head spinning. "He destroyed the evidence," he said, his voice grim. "Whatever was on that desk, he didn't want anyone finding it." Jake's face twisted with frustration. "So now what? We're back to square one." "Not exactly," Bradley said, holding up a crumpled piece of paper he'd grabbed just before the explosion. On it was a single line of text: "The truth lies in the shadows of the past." Bradley's mind raced as he tried to decipher the cryptic message. "It's a clue," he said. "But we'll need help to figure out what it means." "Help from who?" Jake asked, skepticism evident in his tone. "I know someone," Bradley said, already reaching for his phone. "An old friend who specializes in solving puzzles like this." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just want answers," he muttered. "I'm tired of all these games." Bradley placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll get there, Jake. I promise. But we have to take this one step at a time." As they walked away from the burning warehouse, Bradley couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of a much deeper mystery. The pendant, the symbol, Clara's disappearance, it was all connected. And the truth, whatever it was, would change their lives forever. As dawn broke, a soft golden light bathed the small diner where Bradley and Jake sat in a quiet booth. The warmth of the sun's rays felt like a beacon of hope, cutting through the tension of the night before. Jake stared into his untouched cup of coffee, his fingers absently tracing the edge of the table. "So, what happens now?" Jake asked, his voice tentative. Bradley leaned back, his gaze steady. "Now, we rebuild. Together. But first, we need to make sure whoever's behind this can't hurt you or anyone else again." Jake looked up, his expression conflicted. "I don't know if I can handle any more of this. It's been one thing after another." "You're stronger than you think," Bradley said, his tone firm but kind. "And you're not alone anymore." Jake nodded slowly, the weight of those words settling over him. For the first time, he felt a flicker of hope, fragile, but real. By midday, they were back in Bradley's home, a modest but welcoming space filled with framed photographs and the kind of warmth that only a lived-in home could have. Jake's eyes lingered on a picture of a teenage boy grinning beside a much younger Bradley. "That's him, isn't it?" Jake asked softly. Bradley nodded, his throat tightening. "That's my son." "Your father?" Jake picked up the frame, studying the face of the boy he'd never had the chance to know. "He looks so happy." "He was," Bradley said, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "And he would have wanted the same for you." Jake set the photo back down, his fingers brushing the pendant around his neck. "I wish I could have met him," he murmured. Bradley placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, his grip firm. In a way, you have. You're so much like him more than you know. The next step was clear, they needed to confront the man who had orchestrated the chaos. With the evidence they'd pieced together photos, names, and cryptic notes, they built a case and took it straight to Detective Harris. This is solid, Harris admitted, flipping through the documents Bradley laid on his desk. But we need to bring him in before he disappears again. Bradley nodded. We'll do whatever it takes. Harris raised an eyebrow. You've already done more than most would. Let me handle it from here. Jake, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward. I want to help, he said firmly. This guy has been controlling my life from the shadows for too long. I need to see this through. Bradley started to object, but the determination in Jake's eyes stopped him. All right, he said after a pause. But we do this safely. No risks. The final confrontation took place in an industrial park on the edge of town, where the man had been using an abandoned office as his hideout. Harris and a team of officers moved in, their movements precise and coordinated. Bradley and Jake waited nearby, the tension between them thick. Stay close, Bradley whispered, his hand resting on Jake's shoulder. Jake nodded, his jaw set. I'm ready. When the officers entered the building, shouts and the sound of scuffling filled the air. Moments later, the man was led out in handcuffs, his face twisted with anger. You think this changes anything? He spat as he was shoved into a squad car. You don't even know what you've stumbled into. Bradley stepped forward, his expression hard. Whatever you were planning, it ends here. You won't hurt him or anyone else ever again. The man smirked, but there was no real power behind it. We'll see about that, he muttered before the door slammed shut. With the immediate threat neutralized, Bradley and Jake returned home, the adrenaline of the day slowly fading. As they sat together in the living room, the silence between them was comfortable, no longer filled with unspoken fears. Jake broke the quiet first. Do you think it's really over? Bradley took a deep breath, considering his words. The worst of it, yes. But there might still be questions, things we'll need to figure out. And we'll do that. Together. Jake nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. I like the sound of that. Over the next few weeks, they began to piece their lives together. Bradley helped Jake enroll in school, and Jake slowly opened up about his past, sharing memories he had once buried deep. One evening, as they sorted through an old box of Bradley's keepsakes, Jake pulled out a tattered journal. What's this? He asked. Bradley chuckled softly. That was your dad's. He used to write in it everyday thoughts, stories, plans for the future. Jake flipped through the pages, his eyes lighting up as he read. He wrote about me, he said, his voice filled with wonder. He wanted to teach me how to fish. And he talked about taking me to a baseball game. Bradley smiled, his chest tightening with emotion. He would have done all of that and more if he'd had the chance. But you still have those memories, even if they're written down instead of lived. Jake nodded, his fingers tracing the words on the page. I think I want to keep this. Of course, Bradley said, his voice thick with emotion. As time went on, the bond between Bradley and Jake grew stronger. They weren't just family, they were a team, navigating the complexities of their shared history while building a future together. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jake turned to Bradley. Thank you, he said simply. For what? Bradley asked, his brow furrowing. For not giving up on me, Jake said. For showing me that I don't have to be alone anymore. Bradley's smile was warm and genuine. You were never alone, Jake. You just didn't know it yet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past finally giving way to the promise of a brighter tomorrow. The world had a way of shifting under your feet when you least expected it. For Bradley, everything he thought he knew about life, loss, and healing had been turned upside down. It was strange, really, how one small event, one chance meeting on an ordinary night had the power to change everything. That night, when he saw the teenager walking alone on the street, something inside him stirred, something he couldn't explain. But now, as he sat in the quiet of his living room, reflecting on the journey that had led him here, Bradley realized that sometimes, the people we're searching for find us in the most unexpected ways. At first, it felt like fate had dealt him a cruel hand. The pain of losing his son had never really gone away. It had festered, quietly, deep in his chest. There were days when it felt unbearable, when he wondered if he would ever truly heal. But the boy who had walked into his life out of nowhere had shown him something important. Healing didn't always come in the form you expected. Sometimes, it wasn't about moving on from the pain. Sometimes, it was about learning how to live with it, to make peace with it, and to see that maybe, just maybe, the things we've lost aren't as far away as they seem. Bradley had spent years trying to find closure, trying to make sense of the tragedy that had taken his son. He had looked for answers in every corner of his life, searched for meaning in every moment. But all along, he had missed something. Closure wasn't something you found by chasing it. It was something that found you, when the time was right. And for Bradley, that time came in the form of a teenager with haunted eyes and a silver necklace. It was funny, really, how something as simple as a necklace could carry so much weight. A small, unassuming piece of jewelry, tucked away in a box of forgotten things, had somehow become the thread that connected Bradley to the past he thought he'd lost forever. The pendant, so familiar, so painfully reminiscent of his son's life, had sparked something deep inside him. It was like a key to a door he thought had been locked, a door to a world where love and loss could coexist, where family and memory could come together again. And in that moment, Bradley realized that love never really dies. It doesn't vanish when the person is gone, it lingers, quietly, in the things they left behind, in the people they touched, in the memories they shared. As he looked at Jake, now sitting across from him, Bradley saw more than just a teenager he had recently met. He saw the son he had lost, and the future that still had a chance to be written. He saw the healing that had begun not in grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but in the small, quiet moments they shared together. The way Jake had reached out, the way Bradley had listened, the way they had slowly started to rebuild what had been broken. It was all happening, right in front of him, and he couldn't help but feel a deep, quiet gratitude for the unexpected turn his life had taken. Jake, too, had come a long way. He had spent so many years wondering who he was, where he belonged, what his life meant. But now, in the presence of Bradley, he was starting to see himself differently. He wasn't just a boy lost in a sea of uncertainty, he was someone with a past, with a future, with a family who cared. And though it hadn't been easy, though the road had been filled with confusion, pain, and doubt, Jake had started to realize that he wasn't alone anymore. He was part of something bigger. He was part of a story that had been written long before he ever knew it. Bradley thought about that, about how people often believed that the stories they were living were isolated, disconnected from everything else. But in truth, every person's life was part of a much larger narrative, one that wove in and out of the lives of others in ways that couldn't always be predicted or understood. It was easy to feel lost in the middle of it all, to think that the chapters of your life had no meaning. But what he had learned was that sometimes, the connections that mattered most were the ones you couldn't see until much later. And those connections often came when you least expected them, often when you thought it was too late. Jake's journey had just begun, but Bradley knew it was one that would carry him forward. As the days went by, Bradley helped him navigate the complexities of life, school, relationships, the quiet struggles that everyone faced but few talked about. And through it all, They had each other. The relationship they were building wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real. And sometimes, that was enough. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch, the sun setting behind them, Bradley turned to Jake and said, "You know, we don't always get the answers we want in life. We don't always get the closure we think we need. But what matters is that we keep moving forward. We keep learning, growing, and loving, even when it feels impossible." Jake nodded, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the evening. "I think I understand now. It's not about forgetting the past. It's about letting it teach you, about letting it shape you into something better." Bradley smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. "Exactly. And whatever happens next, we face it together." And in that moment, Bradley realized that the future was a road they would walk side by side. No longer was he just an officer trying to make sense of a tragedy. No longer was he a father haunted by loss. Now, he was a grandfather, part of a new generation, a new family. And in that new life, there was room for healing, for hope, and for the love that had never truly gone away. So often, we look for answers in places we think we understand. We search for closure, for meaning, for a sense of direction. But sometimes, the answers find us when we're least expecting them. They find us in the people we meet, in the things we rediscover, in the love we share. And when that happens, we realize that healing doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens slowly, over time, in small, quiet ways that build up until, one day, we look around and realize we're no longer lost. We're exactly where we need to be. As Bradley sat with Jake that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he thought about everything they had been through, everything they had yet to face. And with a deep, steady breath, he whispered to himself, "Love never really dies. It just keeps finding new ways to show up."